大家好，欢迎收听我们的节目。下面我们要播放的内容是由承光学会翻译并制作成音频的形式转载过来的。我们要特别声明，这个音频的版权归原所有者所有。让我们一起聆听这份精彩的内容吧。
I want to talk tonight about democracy. I found it almost hard to believe. You know, we've been talking about efforts by anti-democratic people like Lawrence Tribe and Judge Ludick to deny you and me the right to vote against or for Donald Trump. They want to remove him from the ballot in the most undemocratic misinterpretation of the Constitution. But it's clear that's only part of a larger problem. The New York Times recently ran this headline. You might not be able to read it clearly, but, and you might not believe it if you read it. It says, to improve democracy, get rid of elections. Get rid of elections. I thought it was a joke until I actually read the op-ed. You know, the Times didn't write it, but they published it initially with this headline, to improve democracy, get rid of elections. They were so mocked for doing it that they actually changed the headline. But this is the original headline. On the eve of the first debate of the 2024 presidential race, trust in government is at historic low. Officials have been working hard to safeguard elections and assure citizens of their integrity. But, this is the key sentence right in the top, but if we want public office to have integrity, we might be better off eliminating elections altogether. I'm sure that's what the Times would love to do. They'd love to have the editorial board of the New York Times consisted of young, diverse, woke people selecting the next president. They tried to do that by their very selective use of op-eds and editorials. I was the most frequent op-ed writer of any law professor. I got banned as soon as I defended Donald Trump. So the editorial board of the New York Times would love to decide who to make president. Larry Tribe and Judge Ludick could probably agree among themselves who should be the president. You know, people don't trust democracy. And the essence of this article is, you know, democracy might bring about the election of Donald Trump. Imagine that. So if democracy might bring about the election of Donald Trump, what are we going to do about it? Well, let's end elections. Then we can make sure that Donald Trump is never the president. It's more important to get Trump, to make sure he's no longer the president, than it is to preserve your ability to vote and my ability to vote. These elitists don't trust us. The constant example they give is, look what happened in Nazi Germany in 1932. They elected Adolf Hitler. First of all, they didn't. He got 32% of the vote. The rest of the vote went to other candidates, but because of the way in which the electoral system worked in Germany and because of the lack of courage of the president of Germany, Hitler essentially got appointed chancellor as a minority person. He may have gotten more votes than other people, but he didn't get a majority or anything close to it. And then, of course, he shut down all elections. There was never another election after 1932, and there was never another dissenter. Hitler was even tougher than Putin. Putin apparently today, we're not sure, but apparently today ordered the airplane carrying his political opponents to be shot down. And the leader of the opposition was killed in the plane crash. I mean, that's Banana Republic. And what Hitler produced was much worse than Banana Republic, genocidal republic. But these folks, the Tribes and the Ludicks, actually think that Donald Trump is Hitler. Look, I had a man, a Rothschild, Evelyn Rothschild, recently died. But he told me about 2 years ago, I want you to tell Benjamin Netanyahu that he's worse. He's worse than Adolf Hitler. I said, I'm not going to tell him that. This is totally false. I might tell him that some jerk said that and I'll tell him who the jerk is, but I'm not going to tell him that, obviously. People make these easy comparisons to Hitler and Nazi Germany. There were so many circumstances that combined together to produce the end of the Weimar Republic and the introduction of Nazism. We're not experiencing those situations. They had just lost the First World War. The money had disappeared. Everybody was poor. Unemployment was rampant. And obviously Hitler understood that by scapegoating Jews and others, he could ride to victory, and he did. And he remained in control because he abolished all elections, abolished all dissent, abolished all disagreement, abolished every way in which he could be challenged. That doesn't prove that democracy doesn't work. I'm with Winston Churchill. Democracy may be the worst possible way of governing, except for all the others that have been tried over time. There is no better way than democracy. Everything else is worse. But democracy doesn't guarantee results. Professor Tribe, democracy doesn't mean you win all the time. That's what you want. Judge Ludwig, democracy doesn't mean you get your way. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. I've been voting since 1960. Yeah, 1960. I won. I voted for John Kennedy. He got elected. The next election, I wasn't so sure. I was very ambivalent. I didn't like Lyndon Johnson. He turned out to be a very good president. I didn't vote for Richard Nixon either time. I didn't vote for many of the people who won. And I didn't vote for many of the laws that have been passed. I love democracy. I love democracy even when it comes out against me. And that's one of my criticism of Donald Trump. He didn't accept the democratic result of the last election. He lost, but he was not able to face up to the fact that people were calling him a loser, which is the worst thing that Trump could call anybody. But he lost. Was it a perfect election? No, it wasn't a perfect election. Pennsylvania had some problems. There were problems in Arizona. There are problems with voting machines, particularly when they don't have backup. There are problems with vote counting. But by every possible counting, was no doubt that Biden got many more popular votes than Donald Trump, but he got more electoral votes as well. There were close elections, obviously, in some states, and it could have gone the other way if only a number of tens of thousands of people had voted differently. But Donald Trump refused to accept the outcome of the election, unlike Al Gore. I was involved in that case, Bush versus Gore. Gore won that election. He should have been president. More people wanted to vote for him in Florida than wanted to vote for his opponent, but they were stopped. The butterfly ballot, the hanging chads, closing of polls too early, a range of other issues that distorted the election results. I don't know about other states. I know about Florida because I was down there watching those chads being hung and those butterfly ballots, and we tried to challenge them, and we lost. And Al Gore was a mensch. He got up there and he said, look, I think I won. I think the Supreme Court was wrong, but I accept the outcome. And he went to the inauguration and he said he would work closely with the winner, and he did. And I ended up, although I was opposed to George W. Bush, I ended up liking him. I ended up meeting him and going to the White House. He wrote me a long handwritten letter about Natan Sharansky and how proud he was of the fact that I had represented him and gotten him free from prison. Good relationship with George W. Bush, even though I voted against him. Because democracy is not about Tribe winning. It's not about Ludwig winning. It's not about these other law professors or the others who are out to get Trump winning. Democracy is about a process, about everybody voting, about maximizing the number of people who vote, about minimizing the barriers to voting. Remember, our country didn't start as a democracy. Democracy was a dirty word early in our politics. We are a republic. We are a republic if we can keep it, Benjamin Franklin said. And the early elections, a very small percentage of the population was eligible to vote. You couldn't vote if you were not white. You couldn't vote if you were not male. You couldn't vote if you were not rich. And in some states, you couldn't vote if you were not Protestant. You couldn't vote if you were a Catholic. You couldn't vote if you were a Jew. You couldn't vote if you were a Muslim. Those changed fairly quickly when Andrew Jackson was elected. He really introduced the concept of democracy to America, Jacksonian democracy. Deeply flawed. Didn't apply to Native Americans, who he slaughtered and did terrible things to, the March of Tears and other kinds of brutal ways in which we broke our treaties, broke our contracts, broke our promises with the original people in America, the Native Americans. But it was a democracy for white people. It took the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to broaden it to a democracy for black people. And it took future amendments to broaden the democracy to women and to young people between 18 and 21. Democracy is a process. We have become more democratic, but now there's an attempt to make us less democratic. You know, I wrote to a friend of mine today and I sent him this headline, and he wrote to me and he said, "This is not the New York Times speaking. This is just Adam Grant speaking." No, no, no. The Times gets thousands of op-ed submissions. This is a guest editorial, a contributing editorial writer. The Times decides which to publish. They've decided not to publish me. That's a decision made by the New York Times. The Times decided to publish this op-ed and to run with the title, to improve democracy, get rid of elections, then change the title under pressure. But this is the New York Times speaking to us. If there were an op-ed that said black people shouldn't vote, nobody was, "Oh, the Times didn't say that." Of course the Times would have said it. And of course they wouldn't have published it. But they did publish this. And if they just publish this, okay, one of my other friends wrote me and said, it's a provocative thought piece. The Times doesn't publish provocative thought pieces on its op-ed page. It publishes things they agree with. And it publishes articles whose thrust is part of their narrative. And the narrative that we're hearing from the New York Times is, don't trust democracy. Just make sure that the ends justify the means, and the end is get Trump at all costs. The only way to preserve democracy is to get Trump. If it requires us doing away with voting, get Trump. If it requires disqualifying him and not allowing him to run, get Trump. If it requires impeaching him on grounds that are not constitutionally permissible, get Trump. It doesn't matter. The Constitution will survive, but we won't if Trump gets reelected. That's the mantra. A total and thorough distrust in the Constitution, distrust in democracy. Now, Professor Tribe can't say I don't trust the Constitution. He's made his living on the Constitution for 55 years. So what he has to do, he has to twist it. He has to twist it. But he's been doing that for 50 years. He's a constitutional gigolo. He'll say anything or do anything about the Constitution as long as it serves his ends. He's a master manipulator. And it's interesting because his book is used. I got a letter today from somebody saying, "Oh my God, they've assigned Tribe's book." You can't use that book as a basis for understanding the Constitution. You can use that book as a basis for understanding Lawrence Trump's politics. Lawrence Trump, that's a good typo. That's a good Freudian slip. Lawrence Tribe's psychology, his politics. But for him, the Constitution is a Rorschach test, and he's the one who's going to interpret the Rorschach test. And he changes his mind with the politics. When Clinton was president, he said, the Constitution says that a president can't be indicted and prosecuted while he's president, because that was Clinton. But as soon as Trump got into office, whoops, I've changed my mind. Maybe President Clinton can't be prosecuted and convict it, but President Trump certainly can. I changed my mind. I got smarter, and he'll change his mind again if there's an effort to prosecute Joe Biden. He's willing to change his mind and to change his interpretation of the Constitution, even to change the words of the Constitution, as long as it satisfies his political ends. I've known this for 40 years. I've never been tricked by Professor Tribe. I've never taken seriously his so-called interpretations of the Constitution. I've never taken seriously his treatise on the Constitution. It's not a treatise on the Constitution. If you want to read a treatise on the Constitution, read the one by Justice Story or others that clearly are an attempt to understand and elucidate the Constitution. His is an attempt to manipulate and use the Constitution to serve his partisan and political ends. And we're not going to stand for it. We have to make sure that the Tribe view of the Constitution is rejected in the marketplace of ideas in academia, on the pages of newspapers, in the media. There has to be an opportunity to respond. You're not going to get that on CNN. CNN drools over Tribe and Ludick. MSNBC called him a modern-day Paul Revere. No, a modern-day Joe McCarthy, trying to deny the people the right to vote because he's afraid that Trump might get elected, just like the McCarthyites were afraid maybe a communist would get elected, or maybe a communist would be allowed to help us develop the nuclear bomb, the Oppenheimer movie. And I know the case very well because I've written about it. That was McCarthyism back then. And I think today's McCarthyism is much more dangerous. Why? The past McCarthyism reflected old people trying to relive the past, trying to say that people in the 1930s who accepted communism because that was the answer to fascism were a great danger to the country. They were dying out. McCarthyism had a time limit, an expiration date. The problem with the new McCarthyism is it's being brought to us by young people, by young professors, by academics, by people who in 10 years will be the editorial writers, the editors of the New York Times, the senior partners in Goldman Sachs, the members of Congress, and maybe in 20 years, the President of the United States. And if they're McCarthyites, if they don't believe in due process, because these folks don't believe in due process, they know who's guilty, they know who's innocent, they know what the results have to be. Why bother and be burdened by due process of law? Due process of law? Come on, that's going to interfere with what we have to get done. They don't believe in free speech. If you know the truth, why do you need free speech? Why do you need dissent if you know the truth? And they don't want elections because they can't control elections. They can't control who votes. The greatness of elections is that every single person voting has the same power as every other person voting. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. The voter in Wyoming has a lot more power over who is in the Senate than a voter in California because they have the same two senators and their populations are, tremendously disparate. But it's as close as we can get to democracy under our Constitution. So please, please don't let us ever get to the point where we think that the only way to improve democracy is by ending election. No, the way to improve democracy is to have more elections. It's interesting. People talk about Israel and they don't like the direction in which it's moving, but 5 elections in 5 years, what could be more democratic than that? My God, every year, every time I went to Israel, it was an election. And, Netanyahu got reelected a lot, but not always. He got defeated. And so Israel is a real democracy because it has elections all the time. The New York Times, we don't need elections. We know who's best. We'll pick the next president. We'll write an editorial, and we'll go around and we'll check with the Boston Globe and with a few other newspapers, and together we'll decide who the next president should be. Well, that's how the Politburo decides in the Kremlin who should be the next leader. That's not America.
感谢您一直与我们同行。这里是承光学会，我们以基督的真理为光，搭建保守主义基督教平台，守望美国，祝福中国。让我们一起承光，行在公共领域，将福音传递给更多人。再会，我们下期节目再见。